Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Isabel. I am an event planner for the Reactor, joining you live from Sydney, Australia. Now, before we begin this fantastic session, we do have a quick housekeeping. We are committed to fostering a welcoming, inclusive, and supportive environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, please let's keep our comments respectful and constructive throughout the session. Drop your questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye out for questions throughout the session and answering live. This session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours right here on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This is track 1 of the Data Governance Mixtape series, and I am incredibly excited to introduce our amazing speaker, Michael John Peña. I will now be handing over the spotlight to the amazing MJ, who will be guiding us throughout our session today. Take it away, MJ.
Thanks, Isabel, and welcome everyone to the first track of this mixtape. Okay, so my name is MJ. You can call me MJ from all over the world. A Microsoft MVP, MCT. I also run a data practice within Playtime Solutions. I have a lot of experience within Microsoft technologies. My background is very interesting because I've always been kind of like on the edge of where Microsoft headspace is, but I was never inside Microsoft, right? So I like it at this particular place because I get to work with customers, I get to train people, I get to do this type of things, and pretty much kind of like I'm in the know of a lot of different scenarios and what's on everyone's headspace. Now, speaking of headspace and data governance is probably one of the, I would say, besides AI, LLMs, and Gen AI, right? So data governance is probably one of those topics that's been discussed quite a lot. Knowing from experience, talking to a lot of CIOs, CDOs, chief data officers, data governors, data architects, right? So data governance, especially here in Australia and in parts of the European countries, data governance has always been kind of like the talk of town this year, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? As we talk about AI and the classic example of before going AI, you need to fix your data first, and that's where the whole different platforms, different technology comes in. And this particular mixtape that I'm preparing is kind of like a combination of those key learnings, right? As we go through these different aspects of data governance. Okay, so think of it like at every month or so we'll be talking about a specific topic within data governance, and like at the end of it, the idea is to kind of like wrap it up again into a form of like an album, right? So we'll explore different genre, and when I say genre, that means like different combination of technologies, different kind of like key topics to discuss, right? But the whole idea here is that I want to explain data governance from the idea of what does it mean to you, why you should care about it, what sort of like Microsoft technologies are involved in this kind of like space, and yeah, pretty much what are the options, right? Now, for this one, let's start with the classical, right? So the first theme of this mixtape is, track 1 is about classical. Now, what's our composition for today, right? So today's composition, or or the agenda. Well, first off is that I'm gonna quickly explain the case of modern data governance, right? And like, what exactly are we solving, or what sort of like problems do we have, right? Then second is I'll kind of like quickly explain Microsoft Purview, and of course there are many different resources out there that explains Purview and the house, and like how to do this, how to do that, how to set this up, and so on and so forth. Um, then the third part is something I would like to emphasize around authentication. I kind of mentioned Authentication Allegro, where at the foundation of data governance is about security, and security of its own is a big topic, right? There are different aspects of security, from things around databases, access control, and data governance kind of like falls within that area. But I'll explain more of that later on. And then the concept of data discovery, scanning and classification. And lastly, I'm just going to quickly show you how to set up Purview and things around like what does Purview look like, right? All right. Now let's start with the prelude. So, like a conducted orchestra, effective data governance brings the harmony to your organization's data. All right. So, what am I saying? What am I saying? All right. So, this means that in order to have data governance, it's about assembling the different pieces all together, right? Just like in music, it's about having different instruments, different kind of like different voices and different arrangements of things in order to have a really good composition, right? And same goes with the idea of data governance. So I really like to associate this with music because in order to kind of like come up with a song, it's kind of like a song is an output of this orchestration. And in that case, that if you talk about data governance, a data governance impact is kind of like of its own is a song, right? It's about arranging different things together. It's about creating establishing that strategy, executing that strategy, doing the implementation, and so forth. Um, Now, what are the key challenges that we are facing right now in the in the world right now, particularly in IT and data, right? So this particular diagram here is a kind of like a good interpretation of the good thing that cloud gave us, right? So let me talk about that further. So more than a decade ago, probably around 16, 18 years ago, the usual problem in data was more around scale. And of course, security as well is one of them. But majority of the problem back then was scale. We're in like, oh, how do we scale this database? How do we scale to gigabytes, to a petabyte, terabyte of data, right? So that was the problem statement back then. And not to mention, there's also the idea that there are different data types around the introduction of IoT sensors, telemetry data, unstructured, semi-structured format, and things like that. Now, fast forward from that time up to a couple of years ago, we've kind of like addressed that through various services, various approach, various architecture, various technologies out there that does different things, right? So we have Spark-based solutions like Azure Databricks, Azure Synapse that kind of like solves this big data problem. We have Azure IoT Hub and event streaming with Kafka and event hubs and event grid that kind of like addresses those kind of like messaging problem, right? Now, what ended up happening is that because of the cloud adoption, we've scaled that particular technology, not just on an organization point of view, but even on a business unit point of view. So what that means is that business units and a lot of businesses within an organization, right? Like especially big enterprise organizations, they were empowered, right? They are now technology driven as well. So IT or technology is not just a department anymore or like a function. Like every part of the business is now a kind of like an IT function of its own, right? It has its own data, has its own databases, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of Power BI reports, a lot of different semantic models, right? So that means that there's just so much data that was accumulated during the past decade and a half, right? So compared to where it was before, wherein things are super centralized in the IT space or in the IT domain, things have kind of like decentralized a bit, right? Then, which is good, right? That means that a lot of these businesses are empowered and so on and so forth. But that means that we've had so much data sprawl across multiple environments, right? But at the same time, data is growing. Data has grown. Data is still growing, and data will still astronomically grow, right? And that's a fact, right? Like there's nowhere we can say that there's no more data to be generated tomorrow. Of course, there will be more data to be generated. It's a multiplier, right? Now, given that there are a lot of concerns that has happened in the past few years, especially around regulations, right? And um, particularly in the regulations, regulatory requirements that kind of like infuses the idea that government and different governing bodies, right, and entities are also involved in pushing this governance. So it's not just about, hey, you store as much data as possible, especially when it involves the public sector. Like if you have a business to consumer application, now you need to take care of their data as well. You now have to comply across different governance, right? So that becomes a thing. Then second would be, well, kind of like third point would be security and privacy, right? And um, they these are kind of like two different terms that are very related, but they're not the same, right? When you talk about security, it's about ensuring that the data is not accessible to anyone just because they can, right? It's about allowing certain people or certain access to certain data, right? Privacy, on the other hand, is about you can use the data, but the idea is that you don't necessarily have to identify a specific person, right? And in particular, it's about knowing that, hey, your data as an individual is kind of like kept in private, right? So that's why they're kind of related in a way that a private data is also secured by the company, but at the same time, when you say privacy, it implies that the ownership is upon the consumer or on the user. And next part would be the business value is about extracting from those data assets, right? So and again, this is that part wherein in order to gather insight, you need to have data, and when you have so much data, you now come up with insight, right? However, one thing that we also want to mention around that is that when we extract insights, we probably need to understand where that data is coming from, right? And I'm a natural believer that AI is actually a natural extension of insights, in particular the LLM use cases. Um, so it's very important to kind of like trace back where that data came from, right? So when you have so much data out there and everyone is creating their own data assets, it's probably a good idea to still track and have a lineage of where those data dependencies are. And lastly, is that just kind of like as part of the idea that data is just sprawling everywhere, there are a lot of silos in management approaches. So what ended up happening is that instead of everyone having an accumulation of shared data within organizations, what ended up happening is that everyone's kind of like building their own castles, right? And that means that when you do that, you now create data silos because you tend to kind of like have to define, and I know this is a very complex thing, and that's where consultants like us actually have to dig in and like work with the business on how to define this particular data strategy. But siloed data is a problem, right? Wherein like let's say HR data, you have to work with that with finance data, but who's who, right? Like who's actually in charge of who? Um, there are many different approach to handle that, things around data mesh and data domains and stuff like that. But the core idea there is that this is a challenge that organizations are facing, Right. Now, let's talk about Purview a little bit, right? So the beauty of being a consultant and and I would say a practitioner in the field, right? And I tend to have a good grasp of technologies where how can this actually be applied in the real world, and like what does it mean for organizations, for customers, small, medium, large, right? Like how does it actually kind of like um, what does it mean for them? All right. So big organizations have had a lot of strategies already, right? Even before Purview came in, right? So that means that there are a lot of, I would say, other technologies out there that's been available for quite a while that does the concept of data cataloging, right? The idea of like collecting the data assets and like cataloging them into one single place. So that's been a thing for a while now. I won't name names for this particular track, but a lot of this has been existing for a while, right? And but if you come to think of it, the idea of cataloging has been there for a very, very long time. And that's something you can already do via things like Excel spreadsheet, right? Like just create an Excel spreadsheet and say, hey, this particular asset is this, and you have a record of all of those assets. Or you can go something like, hey, create a database of all the data assets wherein this particular row is base of that, and this particular row is another reference of another data asset, right? So that concept and that idea is not new, right? So that concept of like, hey, where are all the data in my organization? The concept of cataloging them is not new. There's been a lot of efforts in the past to do it. And when you talk about technology capabilities, this is where you kind of like look at, does the data platform itself have that? Does the database itself has that? Or is it something that you need a function or a role to do? Hence, something like a data steward who's going to catalog them manually, right? So that means that the whole concept of tracking has been there, right? So I just want to establish that, right? And that's very important because when I now talk about Purview, you might be thinking that yeah, this, and that, right? But that that first introduction is very important because now when we talk about Purview, now Purview is a SaaS-based solution within Microsoft, right? Um, it's a unified data governance service that kind of like allows you to govern your kind of like data estate. And here's the thing, right? It's not just about your Azure portal data. It's not just about Fabric, right? It's not just about, let's say, SQL Server databases, right? It's a tool, just like many tools out there, that can be used to catalog information. And not just cataloging, right? There's also a concept of data mapping and discovery, right? So to put it in perspective, right? Purview, you might be thinking, isn't this just a glorified spreadsheet? Just like you mentioned, MJ, where like, what's stopping me to just create a spreadsheet and like create a lot of links here and there, right? One is that yes, you can do that, but that means that that's a role and a function that you have to do, right? That means that the capability of like doing that is limited based of that role performing that action. Second is that you're basically performing a service. You're not using a product, right? So that's why when you look at scale, a service is only scalable when there's an organic person doing it, 10 folds, 100 folds, and so on. But when it's a product, right, that's where you can scale it up across the whole organization or on a higher degree, right? So that's why that's a good assessment point to discuss when to use Purview as well. When we're in like, well, maybe we only maybe this organization is too small. We only have one database. Um, Maybe we don't need Purview, right? But then maybe we're a mid-sized organization and we have a couple of databases, couple of Power BI reports, couple of lake houses, and so on. But yeah, maybe putting them in a spreadsheet kind of makes sense, or maybe it's not, because that means that maybe that work could be offloaded to do actual, I would say, analyst work or governance work, right, or more on strategy work. Now, Purview kind of like becomes a tool to enable that function, right? So data mapping and discovering your data cataloging, which is kind of like a concept of like when you have discovered and when you have mapped all of your data, you can now catalog them and kind of like see them, create a concept of like a dictionary, right? So instead of creating your manual data dictionary and so on, you can catalog them. Um, it has insights around those data estate, concept of data sharing and access control, right? So this is that part wherein, okay, you were able to scan, you were able to read the data, and then now you can gather insights out of that data, and then you can also share and enforce policies, right? So that's the whole idea. Now, this thing, if you come look at the history, right, this wouldn't be a problem if you only have one database. So in the 90s and early 2000s, your strategy has always been, if you're, let's say, into Microsoft SQL Server, then all of these are within the domain of SQL Server and the SQL Server clusters, right? And the DBAs can extract all of this information for you. But then again, as I mentioned earlier, we're way past that already. We're now come to a point wherein there are many different data platforms out there. Some are using Fabric, some are using Databricks, some are using SQL Server Managed Instance, SQL Server on-prem. You're using other data platforms as well, right? So that's that thing. You cannot centralize that to SQL Server anymore. But because again, they're just different engines. They're just different data products altogether. Now, Purview is kind of like the answer for that. That kind of like allows you to centralize things again. You're not centralizing the data, meaning you're not essentially putting all of the data into a centralized place. You're just allowing a governance structure to be centralized again. All right. And that's the power of Purview, right? So if you need a capability to centralize things again without having to physically or logically move those data into one data platform, then Purview is a way for you to kind of like centralize the governing structure. It's a way for you to catalog all of this data without actually having to see the data itself. You can just kind of like see the metadata across these different data estates, right? So now, if I'm explaining the concept correctly, that means that the cycle of technology has always been centralized, going decentralized, and then now centralization again, and then maybe a form of hybrid in between, right? Now, let's talk about how that the access control works, right? So here's a bit of a creative drawing or doodle of mine to kind of like explain how this kind of works, right? So again, Purview on its own is not enough, right? So you need to go to the domain of security, right? Because at the backbone of Purview is security, right? So again, because if you just look at scanning data or putting them in a spreadsheet, then what's the value of, again, just collating those data, right? The value is about establishing a secure, governed data estate. That means that in order to do that, first, you need to have the Entra ID, which is kind of like the first violin, right? So it's the one that kind of like encompasses the identity management for you, right? Meaning, on an authentication point of view, who can access what is kind of like within Microsoft Entra ID. Right? Then second is that using RBAC, and we can call them cello section, right? Using RBAC, that means that specific role-based access control, such as being a contributor or a global admin and stuff like that, can be assigned through a security role, right? So that means that you, as a orchestra member, right, you can be an admin, curator, reader, or user. I'll show you a little bit on what these different important roles are. But basically, it's about you having an identity and you having an RBAC assignment, and that security role would allow you to be part of the orchestra, right? Meaning part of the data governance um, team. Now, second is that you can also have that resource level permission. So like a viola section, wherein you can kind of like have a idea of a data access control where a musical score can be accessed, right? So that means that if you can do it via a security role, meaning if if you have a security role, a lot of things are already implied as part of that, or you can do it on a resource level permission, right? Meaning, I'm just not a curator or let's say a violinist, but I'm probably just playing triangle, right? So that's just my role. And in order to do that is that, I can only access a specific type of triangle that I can play, right? So again, just to emphasize that without authentication or without the whole concept of Entra in place, the implementation of Purview is gonna fall off pretty much, right? So that's why if you're looking at foundations, right, Purview kind of like forces you to make sure that you have your Entra sorted or your identity sorted. It forces you to have your data estate sorted, meaning, hey, don't just put everything to LLMs. You need to organize this data properly. You need to classify them somehow, right? And kind of like Purview just kind of like gives you a picture or gives you an idea of what your data looks like or how they're connected all together. Right. Now, the whole idea of Purview is about scanning. Right? Again, at least at the first step of the way when you talk about Purview, it's about scanning. So Purview has the concept of scanning that would allow you to kind of like, let's say, scan different data points. So things like SQL databases, Azure Storage, even Azure Databricks, even on-prem or Microsoft Fabric, or even outside of Purview, things like S3 buckets, right? Or GCP as well. Now, you can basically kind of like think of it like Purview is a way for you to kind of like have an agent that is kind of like deployed or not even deployed. It's about having an agent that frequently scans or frequently looks at these different data points for you, right? So that if you're the data steward, if you're gonna collect all of this in a spreadsheet, then that means that you have to do this every day or every hour or so, right? Across all of these sources. But the whole value proposition here is that it's Entra secured, and you can do this kind of like with automation. All right, now let's go through a live performance, which is the demo. All right. Okay, let me just open my browser quickly. Let me just reshare and present my okay. All right, let me just share my Purview portal. All right, so this is a test tenant that I've been using. Right, so first things first that you probably need to understand is that if you look at the URL, which is not visible because I'm sharing the tab, right? Let me share the whole screen instead. All right. All right. Okay. Oop. All right. So if you look at the my URL here, so Purview, in order to access Purview, all you gotta do is go to purview.microsoft.com. Right. Now it's very similar to something like fabric.microsoft.com, and it's very similar to entra.microsoft.com. Right. So that's why if you look at it in that landscape, right? So pretty much you would think that Purview is a separate SaaS-based solution of its own, right? The reason why I showed you that is that there's also a concept of association of Purview in Azure, right? Right, and I need to explain this to you very diligently, right? So when I go to Microsoft Entra, I'll see that this is my tenant ID, right? And pretty much like this is my tenancy. Now, Purview is tied in to a tenancy. All right. So if I go to settings, and if I go to the account, so it's tied in to a tenant, just like in Entra, just like in Fabric, which is also tied into a tenant. All right. So now, if you're getting the hint so far, that means that one of the value propositions as well of Purview is that it's already connected to your tenant. All right. So it's not something that you kind of like have to spin up as a Azure service, right? Like that could kind of like it's a standalone service of its own. It used to be, right? So the first iterations of Purview was part of Azure, but it has come to a point now that the model is SaaS, software as a service, just like Fabric. All right, so it's now tied into your tenant. Okay, so again, that's a very important distinction here, right? So that means that by default, you already have a lot of those connectedness for you. All right, so now if I just quickly go back to Azure, there is this concept of Microsoft Purview account, right? Actually, even better, if I search for Microsoft Purview, um, you can have many Purview accounts here. So you can create more Purview accounts, right? Assign that to a resource group, things like, right? And then you can have, much more Purview account here. Now, this Purview account is a way for you to kind of like bill your Purview consumption, right? Which in this case, I already have one. I already created that data chain consulting, right? And that's already tied in to my Purview, right? So if you haven't done this yet, you can do it the other way around, right? So you can do it through Azure and create that Purview account, or you can go to purview.microsoft.com, go to the account section, and link this to Azure. All right. So this is so that you have an enterprise account type. This is optional, but this is important, especially for a lot of other features out there, right? Um, Now, here is a capacity size, and that kind of like drives your consumption, right? And that kind of like drives the costs associated with Purview, right? Okay, now Purview have like as just like Fabric and Entra and Azure, right? There is this cog button in there, right? If you look at Azure, that's the portal settings, and if you look at Fabric, there is the extended settings, where you can actually go to admin, and insights and stuff like that. But in Purview, these are all specific to Purview, right? So things around accounts, right? So what you see here is pretty much almost the same as here, all right? So that's why don't get confused. And sometimes it's a bit confusing working on different platforms, but basically the settings here, if you look at Microsoft Purview, that applies to the whole setup of your Purview within that tenancy. All right, now let me close that. Once you've associated that to an account, this is that part wherein Microsoft Entra ID is the foundation of Purview, right? And these are the roles required for you to kind of like administer and make use of Purview. So the obvious ones are global admin, compliance data admin, compliance admin, security operator, and so on and so forth. And there's a description for each one of them on how they apply to Purview, right? Now, you can also create a role group as part of that, wherein like you have security admins, e-discovery, and so on and so forth. Then data connectors, we'll talk about this in a future track. Device onboarding as well. So that part we're in, it's not just about databases anymore. You can also literally register devices as well. Like you can do onboarding, offboarding. And these are the different settings associated to solutions. Okay, so now within Purview, all right, it used to be that Purview have different features, like data scanning is one of them, and classification, and obviously those different things are part of them. Now they've evolved that into concept of solutions now. So within Purview, there are many solutions, right? And here are the core solutions of Purview. Things around auditing, compliance, data maps, settings, and workflows. And then there are specific, I would say, like use case specific capabilities out there around risk and compliance, right? Data governance, data security, things like DLP or data loss prevention, right? And so on and so forth. So we'll cover a lot of this in future tracks, in much more details and around how it kind of like ties in together with other technologies such as Fabric in much more detail. Things like there's a Purview hub here, and what's that? How is that different from Purview, right? And all those different things. Now, one key solution or core solution of Purview is data mapping, right? So I would say for the majority of use cases, you'll probably start with data mapping, right? So from here, the idea is that this here domain, again, the data chain consulting, that's the domain, right? And under that, you would see like a summary of having 263 assets coming from three different data sources and three different scans, right? So from that, from here onwards, it's all kind of like WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, kind of like editor. You can have new connections, you can edit this, right, and so on and so forth. Um, like, who are the domain admins and stuff like that. So let me cancel that. Now, within here, you would see, hey, here are the assets. Then from that, you would have a list view of all of these assets, right? And majority of these are lakehouse items, right, coming from Fabric. But you would be able to kind of like identify that, hey, here are all the data assets that I have within my tenancy, right? So you can even have a physical asset, right, like this, or a business asset, right, that you can actually define that this is a business asset, and so on. Now, let's click on one of the examples. So probably one of these JSON files. So this particular JSON file has been scanned. And if you look here, you would be able to see the hierarchy of that file. So from this JSON file, it came from CosmicWorks Lakehouse, right? And from that, it came from a Fabric Dev mirroring Cosmos DB Hub, which is a Fabric workspace, and it's part of a capacity, right? And then here are your classification. There's no classification. And here's a fully qualified name. Here are the properties, like is file true, and so on and so forth, right? Here's a schema. Kind of like gives you an idea of the schema of this particular file, right? So that means that you don't necessarily have the file, or you don't necessarily have the actual value of this file, but you do have but you do have a metadata scan of that particular file, right? Meaning you understand the property structure around that. Now, you can also see the lineage, contacts, and you can associate owners and experts. Yeah. And then you can look at related kind of like files, usually coming from the same hierarchy, and you can even see the history around here as well, right? So from that, as a data governor, you can also edit this, right? So things around changing the name if you want. You can change the schema, right? You can classify this schema, right? That, for example, this commit info, or let's say formatting version could be all full names, and so on and so forth, right? So this is a way for you to kind of like enforce a classification, column level classification, right? But at the same time, this is that part wherein you either want to do it or you let the business do it, right? So there are like different ways to do this. So things around like if, for example, in Fabric or in this particular lakehouse, you can already set the classification of that one so that when you scan that, you get this information straight away, right? And so on and so forth, right? Like you can even add a manual lineage that, hey, it's actually associated to, let's say, a raw file from a blob storage or so on. Or you can even assign the expert or who's actually owning this data, right? And you can also do a bulk edit, right? So that means that you don't have to edit this one by one. You can edit it, like, let's say, all of the files within this particular lakehouse. If they follow the same structure, then you can kind of like perform a bulk edit, right? Right. Now, let me go back to yeah, go back to solutions, and let's go back to data map. Now, one thing I just want to show you as well is that within the domain, you can also implement subdomains, or you can even create a new domain altogether, right? So in this one, I created a domain called, which is the default domain, Data Stream Consulting, and under that, I created an Azure Databricks and an Azure Databricks Unity Catalog, kind of like subdomains. And from that, you can kind of like create a level of um, classification, let's say for a particular business unit or a particular environment or a particular zone, or however you want to differentiate this all together, right? Now, from that, the next thing that I kind of like want to show you is that if you look at the data sources, this is that part where things are very visual, that would give you a map view or a table view, right, of all of these sources. But the map view is pretty nice, kind of like shows you how they're all tied in together. So things around like Fabric. So I kind of like associated my Fabric tenancy within within Purview, which I'll show much more detail in the future track. But there you go, right? Like you could see that in the data sources, you would see kind of like the lineage of how they're falling in, how they're kind of like related together. So in particular here around Azure Databricks, there are like two ways to register a source. You can do so click on register. So and then from that you can do things like Databricks, and you can either do it through the whole Azure Databricks workspace or a Unity catalog. Um, there are different data sources here that are available, and you can, like for example, if you click on Azure, then that just kind of like associates through the whole Azure resource altogether, right? So if I go here, right, and try to register that, right? So that means that I can associate the whole Azure subscription, right? And yeah, so from that, right, if you look at the details, you would see kind of like the different that there's no recent scan yet around here, and you can perform a scan, right? Um, yeah, and then this is a bit lengthy, and we probably don't have enough time to do all of this scanning, right? Okay, but there you go. We'll cover this in future around the whole database scanning in Azure, particularly around databases. But the idea is that from here, right, you can again go back to solutions, go back to data map, and in the sources, right, you can register as many data sources as you want, and then from that you perform a scan and you can gather the assets. So in the past, I've already associated this to Fabric. So if I go and view details, I was able to perform a scan, and I was able to discover 54 assets. So this particular one was a scan, and then from that we were able to gather 12 assets, and so on and so forth. You can even try to do a full scan now. Let's see if this is gonna work. Um, then from that, it's gonna queue. And remember the one I showed earlier around the whole association of purview count. That's where the billing or the capacity is associated with. Right. So this will take a while, right? So that's why you probably want to make this automated, right? And probably do it on a nightly basis and so on and so forth. Um, but yeah, like for example, this one here even comes with a log, right, of all the successful scans. And if there's some kind of like errors and exceptions, it's going to show there. Right. Now, one thing I probably want to showcase in the future is this unified catalog, which is a bit different from the Unity catalog of Databricks, but um, nonetheless, it's a very interesting thought process altogether. All right. So, all right, I'll be wrapping up pretty soon. Okay. So now to kind of like answer few of the most common questions around Purview and around data governance is that one, without Purview, what are the alternatives out there, right? Again, I've mentioned if your source is coming from a data platform, so things like Azure Databricks, there are already a level of data governance capabilities through Unity Catalog available. Even with Fabric, there are a concept of kind of like data governance, like a subset of Purview as well around that. And if you look at SQL Server, you basically have access to a lot of your data state altogether, right? Um, but then again, right, like the whole value proposition of Purview is that you're trying to centralize them all together and enable your data governance team to be kind of like productive, or I would say like enforce these policies without having to, go to 20 different portals, right? So that's kind of like the whole idea there. So once a data source has been established, it's about just sticking to Purview, and from there, right, like you kind of like enforce the policies, right? And one thing that is also very interesting that I want to talk about in the future is around 365 and Copilot, right? And how that's really tied in really well with Purview. So at the end of the day, Purview again is a tool, right? It's not the magic bullet or the answer for everything, but some of the real conversations I've had and I'm still having with a lot of different executives is that sometimes you probably don't want to have this one yet because it just exposes you that hey, you actually haven't done 300 different homeworks, right? Like, oh, it turns out we have so many SharePoint sites that's still available out there, like everyone can just access, a lot of loose documents that's accessible, blob storage that you can access through public, internet, right, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, right, so Purview just kind of like gives you that capability altogether that would give you an understanding of your data state, right? And again, just like a classical music where it's intended to be soothing, or it's intended to be like arranged properly, right? The reality is embracing something like Purview or going to this process is a journey, right? And it's not just once you've created the song, it's finished. It's an ongoing gig, it's an ongoing track, if you may, right? So that's why I want to segue now to wrap this up and say thank you very much for joining this first track. And in the succeeding track, we'll talk more about specific integration points of Purview with different capabilities, different technologies out there, and how we can kind of like leverage this awesome technology to kind of like be, I would say, AI ready, right? So to embrace AI with full confidence and to adopt Fabric and other data technologies out there, knowing that I have a secure foundation behind me. All right. With that, thank you very much. Over to you, Isabel, as I wrap this up.
Thank you, MJ. That was a really good session and very insightful. And I don't know about everyone else at home, but I thought the way MJ has structured this entire series about, how throughout every single session, we're learning something new. And then at the end, we have what composes a whole mixtape. It's incredibly creative, MJ. So thank you so much for bringing us throughout the session number one, like you mentioned, and like I mentioned at the beginning. You can also see the link that is just scrolling throughout at the bottom. If you want to register for the rest of the sessions, you can join and go to the link aka.ms/data.gov mixtape. You can register for the entire series and you can join us as we, like MJ said, as we create this entire mixtape. And we are right on time, MJ, so I will have to end the live stream. But thank you so much. This was a great session. And thank you to all of our viewers at home. And hopefully, we'll be able to see you on the next session. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, MJ. And I hope
Awesome.
everyone has a wonderful
Thanks, Isabel,
rest of.
and we'll see everyone soon. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.